This week we will provide an expert presentation on the panel discussion Thinking Theologically About Modern Art, as well as the readings from this week from Elkins, Darnus, and Seidel, and is presented by Charles Caldwell, Crystal Helt, and Linda Williams. The title of our chapter in Elkins is Rhea's Story Explained, How Artists Try to Burn Away Religion, and relates the story of Rhea, a female student who created a ceramic house based on the 14 Stations of the Cross. Beginning as a church, she omitted all religious referencing and finally dumped glaze over her deconstructed church, fired it, at which point the whole edifice cracked. Her subtraction was not new, as the Romantics were some of the first to subtract away the trappings of the church. They stripped away the ceremonies of the church to get at the living religion inside. Landscape painting was steeped in this meaning for artists like George Inness, who strove to breathe, quote, the sentiment of humanity through rivers, streams, sky, clouds, all things we see, the love of God, and the desire for truth, unquote. They felt religiously about nature without always speaking about religion. Perhaps in some ways we might also see Rhea's work as similar to that of Kazimir Malevich. Where he wanted to, quote, free art from the burden of the object, unquote, she wanted to use her art to free herself from the burden of organized religion. Many of the first generation of abstract painters, including Wassily Kandinsky, were steeped in theosophy, the teachings of Helena Blavatsky, and her book Secret Doctrine, and mystical nature worship. For some modern artists, abstraction was a skeleton key to a truth higher than naturalism and beyond mere paint and canvas. As Rudolf Steiner said, quote, what appears in painting is a depiction of something supersensible, a revelation of the spiritual world, unquote. This would be the opposite of the academic understanding of abstract painting. Painting from a theosophical perspective is a remnant of a lost communication with the spiritual world beyond ordinary vision. Charmian van Wiegen read Secret Doctrine in 1946 and continued to paint personal visions of divine truth into her old age, informed by these teachings. Elkins spoke of an exhibition entitled Contemplations on the Spiritual in Glasgow, where artists made artworks in and around religious settings, noting that all the works speak eloquently in sacred spaces, but that there is a difference between that and discovering through art how venerable spiritual traditions touch the contemporary consciousness. Considering the property of sacredness can be helpful in answering this question. The simple arrangement of this graph can engender tremendous complexity, since artworks can both symbolize sacredness and be examples of sacred objects. Van Wiegen's painting that we saw in the last slide is at one and the same time a sacred object and an object that tells us about the sacred. Darnus begins with the question, what are Christians to make of the confusion that currently exists in the art world? When we consider the wide range of art styles that modify the body, the environment, with the inclusion of technology, popular culture tends to dominate art as its focus. This leaves little room for traditional forms in media and also diminishes the line between high and low art. The author suggests that there is pluralism in contemporary art that can create opportunities for Christian artists. Sculptor Lynn Aldrich is used as an example of this perspective, since she asserts that sculpture plays a part in the visual feast as it expands into a wide variety of media and materials. Chapter 6 outlines 5 characteristics of modern art with the goal of finding openings for Christian engagement. The first is an element of performance. Using process-focused artists such as Jackson Pollock as an example, Darnus illustrates that modern art has an element of performance. The author ties performance to the presentation of Christian truth in its call for personal response. The second characteristic is an interactive character, which Darnus describes as an insistence on connecting with the viewer as they complete a work of art. Lynn Aldrich's breadline, seen here, is an example of an installation that requires meaning attributed by the viewer in order to complete it. Collaborative character is the third characteristic, and building upon the interactive element, it reflects on the partnership between artists and the source of their inspiration. The fourth characteristic is focused on the saturation of technology in the moving image. Darnus suggests that since God's presence is in culture, it can still exhibit grace. The final characteristic is a spiritual element. Postmodernism often reaches for an experience that is deeply spiritual, but Darnus expresses concern that many have lost touch with the Christian tradition and others have lost their imaginative traditions. Darnus ends the chapter by addressing the issue that Christian artists are not being nourished by an artistic Christian tradition, while contemporary artists have lost touch with their faith traditions. In a renewal of Christian spirituality and worship, the artistic gifts of the congregation have the potential to impact the broader world. In the chapter entitled Art Criticism by Seidel, we're given an overview on the history of art criticism. He points out that our experience of art can result in four byproducts: art criticism, philosophical discourse, art history, and new art forms. Christian faith can and should inform discussion and participation in each of these areas. We're then told about the Greenberg-Rosenberg debate, which is not a debate about art, but about what art criticism should be. Where Rosenberg related to using art criticism as a form of social and cultural criticism, Greenberg was to use art criticism as a way into modern art, just as it was for other artistic periods, for example, medieval, Renaissance, etc. The rise of academic art criticism set up a debate between those inside and outside academia. The debate challenged when journalistic criticism was legitimate or just a tool of the market, and if art criticism should be strictly about aesthetic issues or should it include non-aesthetic issues such as politics. In the final analysis, Seidel concludes that criticism is not merely an act of judgment or mode of description, it is the practice of discerning reception. The Christian faith possesses the aesthetic and intellectual resources to make the most sense of aesthetic experience. However, Christian art criticism should use these resources in an expansive way rather than attempting to maintain airtight confessional boundaries or a narrowly defined Christian perspective. Because culture has become insensitive to the liturgical and sacramental, what is needed is critics and curators who can articulate, illuminate, and revive these elements embedded in our common human condition, especially as brought to life in Christian faith. In our lecture, Thinking Theologically About Modern Art, Professor Harries brought up the idea from Ben Quash's lecture on desublimation of modern art and the problem of photos of the attack on Baghdad and how they had made it somehow beautiful. He pointed out that art is bounded and that once you bound something and make it art, you put it into something which corresponds to the medieval concept of balance, symmetry, and clarity, which are certain aspects of beauty. Therefore, your attempt to show the total devastation of something actual is somehow made consolatory. He pointed out the focus and the challenge of the crucifixion, the most cruel form of torture, yet it is made into a beautiful work of art. Even a famous painting like Guernica, which was meant to show the horrors of war, actually, because it is a work of art, it has some of the elements of balance, form, and elegance about it, making it consolatory. The question was brought up by an audience member in reference to the paintings of the Stations of the Cross at St. John on Bethnal Green, which is in our image of this slide. He made the statement that whether they are experienced as conducive to worship or just frightening would be up to the viewer to decide. Professor Harries said that the issue is only resolvable in terms of Christian theology and that the cross is inseparable from the resurrection. In fact, that all art is ultimately grounded in the cross and resurrection of Christ. Ben Quash spoke of the importance of thinking about the relationship between architecture and some of the works of art we've been looking at. He spoke of being at a symposium where Roger Scruton had been in attendance and his interest in the strong need for the spiritual in architecture, in particular the lack of humane spaces in modern architecture. He made particular note of the fact that moldings were relentlessly attacked in modernism. He pointed out that certain delicate moldings show that the building is not just about the materials from which it is built, but, for example, the light which is captured by moldings and the way that light and darkness can become articulate in the moldings of a piece of architecture, creating places that you could really be at home in, and as Scruton put it, rest. As Scruton said of the photo he took at Pietro de Cortona at Santa Maria della Pace, quote, "The exterior corner is seen as a form arrived at, not a form imposed, and arrived at through the generative power of the order concealed within it. This is stone, but stone with a soul," unquote. Francis Spalding brought up the painting Paths of Glory by Christopher Nevinson, which was censored, and when he exhibited it again, he got a huge strip of paper and wrote censored on it and posted it over the painting and exhibited it. Though the fact that it was rejected as something unacceptable affirms the sense that although they were trying to paint the unpaintable, it's facing the impossible, the incommunicable. She points out that these things do have value and aren't always consolatory. George Pattison pointed out that the only works of visual art that really do anything to him are images he has seen in both the Ghetto Museum in Prague and in the Siege of Leningrad Museum in St. Petersburg, children's drawings. Drawn by children in concentration camps and in the city besieged for 3 years, where 1 million people died, you see written underneath the picture, "It's a new year. Maybe we can look forward to a jolly summer," by Olag, age 9. Then you read that Olag was killed in an artillery barrage on March 15th. This feeds into how we react to things. Images become routinized, and the power of the image is diluted. Patterson was teaching a class in the theology of art in Denmark. The students were in their 20s going for ordination and were all shocked by the crucifixion painted by Grunewald. They actually gasped upon seeing it. They were shocked by the image, which cut across what people expect from an ecclesiastical representation of it. So he said, context is not all. Someone who's looking at a crucifixion with a theological or a faith position stands in the tension of crucifixion resurrection is going to interpret it differently from someone who doesn't. Jonathan Castley Cate said that he was resistant to the church becoming a cultural space. He favored having fewer works of art going into churches, but works that were very sensitive and thoughtfully worked through, rather than the cathedral becoming a place that is just a rolling program of cultural events and art exhibitions. He then pointed to the example of Alison Watts' Still, her monumental painting in Old St. Paul's Scottish Episcopal Church in Edinburgh, installed in 2004. Watts said of her work how she worked on the piece for a year, returning daily to the memorial chapel to remind herself of the space. She wanted to convey how she felt in the chapel, the overwhelming sadness. She said she thought she knew every inch of it, but seeing it in that space, she realized how little she recognized it, taking on the quality of the space around it. George Patterson noted the Stations of the Cross by Hans Feibusch and how he talked about the importance of responsibility on the part of the artist, which goes along with risk-taking on the part of the church. This Station of the Cross is from St. Alban the Martyr in Holborn. Feibusch was Jewish, but did mainly Christian religious paintings and murals. He converted to Christianity in 1965 when he was 67 years old. Which brings us to our questions for the week. Number 1, do you believe that there is a reliable way to distinguish an abstract work of art that was intended to convey a spiritual message from one that was not? Given that the requirements for an art critic are to achieve a venue and maintain an audience, and given the difficulty of Christian art to obtain a more widespread viewing, what should be the way forward for a Christian art critic? In the panel discussion, the idea was presented that we may in some sense be consoled by an image that depicts something horrible. Do you agree? In this regard, would you make a distinction between Picasso's Guernica and a painting on the crucifixion? Number 4, how would you suggest that Christian artists develop an imaginative tradition that is both religious and contemporarily relevant? Number 5, do you feel that modern architecture has created less humane spaces for us? Do you believe that attention to details such as moldings can create more spaces for us to rest? Do you see a need for the spiritual in architecture? Number 6, do you agree with Professor Harries that all art is ultimately grounded in the cross and resurrection of Christ? Thank you very much for watching our presentation.